sometimes you get a news story that needs more depth, more exposition, more explanation to investigate what's actually going on. And recently that was the case with Square Enix. But sometimes events conspire to hand you a big chunk of information which can inform what's going to happen with that story going forward. Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome to a big slice of Gosu News. So what is a big slice? Well, if Gosu News is choice cuts from the world of video games, a big slice is where I take a specific story from Gosu News and I will collate various bits of information from various parts of the internet. I will put them together and see what kind of a picture we can make to inform us as to how things might progress within video games. Because video games, contrary to popular belief, do not exist within a bubble. There are things from other media that can inform and also influence how things are going to progress within video games. With that in mind, let's look at the recent story we had at the beginning of May, where Square Enix sold their Western development studios to Embracer Group for $300 million. The development side that was sold was Crystal Dynamics, Eidos Montreal, Square Enix Montreal. There was a bunch of IP that went with it. I think it was about 50-odd titles, including Tomb Raider, Legacy of Kain, Thief, and Deus Ex. Square Enix did keep the Square Enix Collective and a few other things like Life is Strange and Just Cause, so they're not completely removing themselves from Western development. A lot of people were confused as to why this actually happened, given that Sony had paid a lot of money, a few billion for Bungie, and Microsoft were trying to buy Activision Blizzard for around $70 billion. So why did Square Enix offer Embracer Group such a cheap deal? And the speculation was rife at the time that maybe it's because Square Enix wanted someone to come and buy them, which is an angle I never really bought into. I speculated that maybe Square Enix were doing something completely different to what everyone expected. Maybe they weren't looking outward but looking inward, and the reason for that is Capcom and Bandai Namco, two other Japanese companies who have recorded record profits, and that's because instead of looking outward, they basically doubled down on what they already knew how to do. Capcom have achieved enormous success with the remakes of Resident Evil, but also with Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village, whereas Bandai Namco basically hit a home run with Elden Ring, which is the latest Souls-like game from them. So there you have two Japanese publishers who are putting out games that the Western market really, really likes, and Square Enix are probably thinking, we can do that as well. Why aren't we doing what they're doing? And in order to find out where things might have possibly gone wrong for Square Enix, you have to go back in time a little bit. From 1987, with the first Final Fantasy game, Square Enix have released a numbered Final Fantasy game within 2 to 3 years of the previous game, all the way up until the present. And that's where things get a little bit weird, with 16's announcement and release date. But we'll get to that in a bit. For the first 9 Final Fantasies, there was no sequel to the previous game. Each of the games was in an individual world with unique characters, unique setting, unique story. Everything was different from one game to the next. And that was the case all the way up to Final Fantasy X, which came out in 2001, and then its sequel, Final Fantasy X Part 2, which came out in 2003, still within that 2 to 3 year window. Now, in between those two games, you had the release of Final Fantasy XI Online, which achieved a reasonable degree of success as an online game. And then there was Final Fantasy XII, which was the last Final Fantasy game on the PlayStation 2, and it was a successful game for the time. And that's where it gets a little bit squiffy, because it was around 2006 that a bunch of developers at Square Enix got together and came up with the genius idea of Fabula Nova Crystallis Final Fantasy, which was going to be the 13th game and also a bunch of other games that tied into this kind of suite of games. And it was designed to be across multiple platforms and possibly even across multiple media as well. Now, the idea was never fully realized, but we did get a couple of games from that particular mini-series of Final Fantasy games. Final Fantasy XIII, 13 Part 2, Lightning Returns, Final Fantasy Type 0, and Final Fantasy Versus 13, which later became Final Fantasy 15. Now here's where the problem is. All of these games cover the window from around 2009 to 2016, a 7-year period. And within that period, everything was kind of tied in to this concept of Fabula Nova Crystallis in some way. In particular, the Final Fantasy XIII games and Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, because they were developed using Crystal Tools, which was a game engine created and used internally by Square Enix. And unfortunately, Crystal Tools caused significant problems and delays and really wasn't fit for purpose, which was why it was ditched for games like Type 0, Final Fantasy XV, and Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. Now, the problem with Type 0 and 15 was that the influence of Fabula Nova Crystallis really hampered the development of both games in certain fundamental ways, in particular when it came to the story and the characters. There's very mixed opinions on Final Fantasy 15 and Type 0. As a backdrop to that, you had Final Fantasy 14, which had turned a corner thanks to Naoki Yoshida, who was the director. Now, Naoki Yoshida is a problem solver at Square Enix. He is now on the board of directors, he's an executive, but he is still the director of Final Fantasy XIV. He is also the producer of Final Fantasy XVI. If you want to know about the fall and rise of Final Fantasy XIV as a game, NoClip have done an amazing documentary in 3 parts. I will link all 3 parts in the description below. Anyway, the year is now 2015. The first expansion for Final Fantasy XIV 2.0 comes out, which is Heavensward, and it's met with enormous positive receptions from both critics and players. They absolutely love this expansion. They love the story, people are crying over it, they've never seen anything like it in an MMO, and that then marks a big turning point for the fortunes of Square Enix as a video games publisher and as a company. Because from then, Final Fantasy XIV has gone on from strength to strength, with Stormblood in 2017, and then Shadowbringers in 2019, and then finally with Endwalker in 2021. But I think the biggest turning point is Shadowbringers, and here's why. Final Fantasy XV came out in 2016, and it still had a certain sanitized feeling to it. Even though you see the character of Noctis grow and become more of a king, and there's all sorts of sacrifices made, and the story is dark in places, but it still feels very, very safe. There doesn't feel like any personal investment on the part of the player. And that seems to be where Square Enix have really dropped the ball with the Final Fantasy games. That emotional investment from the player, that basically disappeared. It started disappearing in 12, but you can see how much it fades away by the time you get to Final Fantasy Type 0. But it was there in big ways in Final Fantasy XIV, thanks to the quality of writing from people like Natsuko Ishikawa and various others. With Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, and Endwalker, what Final Fantasy XIV actually managed to do was take the Final Fantasy franchise back to the old days when they actually told meaningful stories that could be quite dark in terms of their theme and very, very mature in terms of their tone and their atmosphere and the characters that were being shown. These expansions allowed players to connect with the story and the characters in ways that they used to do back with Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And yes, there are a lot of influences from those games within Final Fantasy XIV, which helps with that connection. But it also became clear to Square Enix that the path that they'd been following for Final Fantasy was the wrong one. And so they have to do a course correction. They have to go back to how they used to make Final Fantasy games. They had to return to making the world first, then putting the players on it after you made the world. And that, I think, is one of the key signals to Square Enix's board of directors as to how they needed to go forward. I don't think any decisions had been set in stone back in 2019 when Shadowbringers came out, but I think they were confirmed when Endwalker basically achieved massive success. So much so they had to stop selling the game because they couldn't accommodate everyone on the servers. Now, if you look at Final Fantasy VII Remake as a game, as a standalone thing, It just seems like it's adding and expanding on the world of Final Fantasy VII. But if you look at it within the context of Square Enix as a company, you'll see there's a big difference in how they might have done Final Fantasy VII if Final Fantasy XIV hadn't been as successful as it has been. We may never have seen a Final Fantasy VII remake if it wasn't for the success of Final Fantasy XIV. And Final Fantasy VII Remake's success has led to the release of the pixel remasters of the SNES and PS1 era Final Fantasy games. Which brings us finally to Final Fantasy XVI and why this may be the biggest cost correction outside of Final Fantasy XIV in the history of Square Enix. There are several reasons for that. Number one, Final Fantasy XVI looks to be a single character game, and by that I mean you may end up in situations within the game where you have other characters around you playing and helping you as part of a team, but in general I think that you'll be controlling Clive Rosfield, the main character, and it will be solo missions all the way through. You see that from the Dominance trailer with the combat there, and also in the Awakenings trailer with the combat there. Tying into that are two particular things. Ryota Suzuki is the combat director for Final Fantasy XVI, and he used to work at Capcom on Devil May Cry 5, Dragon's Dogma, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2. He's arguably one of the best in video games at specific types of combat within video games. But also tied into that is a little known story from a book that Naoki Yoshida wrote called Yoshida Uncensored, How We Were Able to Remake Final Fantasy XIV. And in that book he talks about how he and Hiroshi Takai, the director of Final Fantasy XVI, and Hiroshi Minagawa, the art director of Final Fantasy XVI, the three of them worked together on a now cancelled game which was basically Bloodborne before Bloodborne was even a thing. Now, if you look at the combat and the way the world seems to work within Final Fantasy XVI, there is a certain thread of a Souls-like game within certain aspects of it. But it doesn't seem to have the guns or the mechs or the steampunkness of Bloodborne. And again, we can find the reason for that in an interview that Naoki Yoshida did back in 2019 when he said he wanted the next Final Fantasy to be more fantasy and have less machines and no mecha. He did make that comment kind of as a joke because he was complaining about the Gallian Empire in Final Fantasy XIV being too powerful, but the influence of that may still remain. Final Fantasy XVI looks to be more fantasy and less technology. One of the things that makes me think the Bloodborne before Bloodborne DNA still exists within Final Fantasy XVI isn't just the fact that Yoshida is the producer, Takai is the director, and Minagawa is the art director. It's also the fact that, according to Naoki Yoshida, Final Fantasy XVI is going to have an expansive skill tree system built for unique character growth. Back in 2021, Naoki Yoshida was with Hironobu Sakaguchi, the original creator of Final Fantasy, at the Tokyo Game Show, and they were doing an interview together where they were talking about Sakaguchi's new game, Fantasian. But when he was asked about character customization within Final Fantasy XVI, Yoshida revealed that the game would feature a skill tree that expands out in a similar way to the one found in Sakaguchi's new game, Fantasian. He goes on to say, there's usually two ways to play a character. You can either put yourself into the shoes of a predefined protagonist, or like in Final Fantasy XIV, you can become your own protagonist. But even in the case where you play a predefined hero, it's better to have some sense of customization in the character's progression as it gives wider options of play. Which again sounds like the unique character builds that you find in Souls-like games. But that's just one aspect. There's another thing that I think highlights just how much of a course correction Square Enix is undergoing with their mainline franchise. And that has to do with crystals. See, crystals have always been a thing for Square Enix, but in Final Fantasy XIV, the concept of mother crystals we already are familiar with, so I'm leaving that to one side. If you played Endwalker, you know what happens, and you know what I'm going to say next then, because you probably picked up on it from the Awakening trailer. The legacy of the crystals has shaped our history for long enough. I think that's not just an in-game narrative thing, I think that is actually a statement from Square Enix themselves. We will no longer be bound by our past, by the way we have always done things. We are going to innovate, we are going to step forward into a new generation and make games that people want to play. And I think a lot of that has to do with the influence of Final Fantasy XIV. The executives at Square Enix have seen just what happens when you get players who are emotionally invested into the world that you have created, who are emotionally invested into the characters that live within that world. And I think Final Fantasy XVI is the first step on them realizing a new path for themselves, which I hope is going to be a lot more open and mature with regards to the stories that they want to tell and the characters that live within those worlds that they create. Now, the 300 million that they've received from Embracer Group, I think part of that is going to go towards new servers for Final Fantasy XIV, so they can have more players playing that game. I think part of it is gone into Final Fantasy XVI for polishing and fine-tuning and bug fixing for that game, so it can be released on schedule. And I think part of it is going to go into how Square Enix are going to be developing future projects. Now, some among you might ask why I think that 300 million that Square Enix is getting from Embracer Group is going to be invested in those ways, and why it's not going to be spent on blockchain and NFTs. And the reason why is because Square Enix, during their full year financial results briefing on May the 13th, actually came right out and said so. They won't be using any of that money on blockchain or NFTs. Instead, they're going to use it on their core business, which to me suggests finishing and polishing and bug fixing Final Fantasy XVI. Some of it will go there. A portion of it will go to new servers for Final Fantasy XIV. After all, people want to play it, they need more space. Servers cost money. And the rest of it will go towards restructuring and redeveloping how they approach video games going forward. And I think part of that restructuring is going to involve seeing more focus on storytelling. I think Square Enix, as a publisher and as a video games developer, are exceptionally good at specific types of story. And I think if they really drill down on the narrative side of things and focus on making games that people can immerse themselves in, that aren't just experiences, so things like Endwalker and Shadowbringers, hell, the majority of Final Fantasy XIV since A Realm Reborn, Final Fantasy VII and the remake, going back to Final Fantasy VIII and IX, going back to Final Fantasy IV and VI. Those sorts of worlds where you can basically sink into them. I feel that that's where Square Enix's core strength is. So when I'm reading an article about where they're going to invest the 300 million, and I see them saying, rather than using the proceeds from the divestiture in new investment domains such as NFT and blockchain, we intend to use them primarily to fund our efforts to foster solid IP and to enhance our development capabilities in our core digital entertainment segment, and that our intention is to undertake fundraising efforts for our new investment domains separate from those for our core business, and we are considering various possibilities, including potentially establishing a CVC. Now, for those of you who don't know, a CVC is corporate venture capital, and on the one hand, I would be a bit wary of it, but given that Square Enix have the Square Enix Collective, it might actually be a good opportunity for Square Enix if they work the CVC in conjunction with the Collective to actually invest in indie developers in a big way. There are opportunities, but they're based on restructuring how you do things and pulling back from reaching too far. So will Square Enix be successful in their new approach? We'll have to see, but I have high hopes about Final Fantasy XVI, and I'll talk about those hopes and some of my suppositions about what's going to happen in Final Fantasy XVI in the next big slice of Gossip News. I don't doubt for 1 minute that there are probably things that I've forgotten about or missed out on. If I have done so, or if you have any thoughts about things that I've said, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, I'm going to leave that there. I will see you all on the next episode of Gossip News or on the next big slice. Until then, thanks for watching.